JavaScript for Enterprise Development, the FaaS and the Serverless, with Simon MacDonald.
All right, so today I'm here to talk about the FaaS and the Serverless. And before we get into that, just a quick bit about myself. My name is Simon MacDonald. I'm a developer advocate working at Adobe. Do a lot of talks all over the world. This is kind of my infinite slide. If only somebody could take a picture of me, taking a picture of me, taking a picture of me all the way down. But it's a webinar and not live. But if you ever want to get in touch with me later to ask any follow-up questions, the best way to do it is Twitter, where I'm at MacDonaldST, which is my old Unix user ID. That's why it's such a weird ID. Also, just before we started this, my keyboard stopped working. So professionalism right out the window. Again, 2017 MacBook Pro, so everybody's aware of all the problems with that. So bear with me if things go horribly astray. Initially, this talk was going to be quite a bit different and probably a lot better, but sometimes you just really have to scratch an itch. And I was going to talk a lot about how I saved myself some money by converting from a Node Express application to serverless. But then this FaaS and the serverless idea came into my head, and I just couldn't make it go away. So I'm going to spoil parts of the Fast and the Furious movies, but you know what? It really doesn't matter. You're not watching these for the plot. There's not much to go on there. I mean, these movies are so bad that they go off the edge of being bad, and they come back around on the other side, and they're really, really good. So that's really what I've noticed in watching them, is that they're so bad, they're good, they're that enjoyable. Now, if you're not familiar with Fast and the Furious, you may not know that they've made not 5, not 6, but actually 8 different movies in this series so far. And 9 and 10 are already being worked on, so they're gonna have at least even 10 movies. As well, there's a spin-off planned with 2 of the other characters as well. And I really wish this was live so I could ask everybody by a quick show of hands who has seen all the movies, because I'm always kind of interested in who else has gone on this journey with me. And then, of course, my follow-up question is, I want to know who hurt you by making you watch all 8 of these movies. But I digress. Now, what does Fast and the Furious have to do with serverless? Nothing at all. It just gave me an excuse to borrow all of these movies from a friend and rewatch them, and basically in the name of research, and forcing this analogy on all of you that I'm about to punish you with. So why did I borrow these movies? Why didn't I just get them online? Well, because it was a cottage, and at a cottage you don't have very good internet, so we had a bunch of DVDs. So amazingly, I watched these all on DVDs as well. So let's get into punishing you with this analogy. Now, when it comes to the movies, we have a bunch of characters in movies. And as you can see, all of these characters do one thing, and they do it extremely well. Dom takes care of the planning. Letty takes care of the punching. And at this point, I really wish I could have a supercut of Letty just punching people, but we don't have enough time for that. It would take probably 45 minutes or so. And I love Letty, don't get me wrong. And as well, Tej, he's the guy, he's the mechanic. He can fix anything. And then Roman is our comic relief. Now, what the interesting thing about all of these characters is they do one thing really well. And when it comes down to it, that's how you should properly build functions. They should do one thing, and they should do it really well. So whether they're fetching some data, processing it, transforming it into a new form, or doing some sort of UI thing, you don't want your functions to do too much work as well. Now, taking a look at the characters, a good character in a movie should have their own agency. So a well-written character should not depend upon another character for its meaning. That's really how you know whether or not the movie is well-written, because if you have characters that are in there just to be, crutches for another character, they have no other purpose other than to give them some backstory, that's not a very well-written character. So they'll have their own agency. And when it comes to functions, they should be completely stateless. They should not depend upon anything but the input that is passed into them. They shouldn't have to be propped up by other functions as well. Now, a good character remains internally consistent, so that the way that they behave at the beginning of the movie should be characters going to have growth, but they should stay internally consistent to their own behaviors. And when it comes to functions, that they should also remain internally consistent. If you give a function the same input, it should always produce the same output and no side effects whatsoever. So those functions should remain pure. And of course, I said characters should do one thing really well, give them something to stand on. And when it comes to functions, they should really do one task per function. They shouldn't do too much stuff. Now, we get into the character Brian, played by Paul Walker. So Brian's really interesting because he's kind of at the center of all of these movies. So in the first Fast and the Furious movie, we start off with Brian chasing a car thief, played by, it's Dominic Toretto. And then, of course, Brian falls in love with Dom's sister, Mia, and that doesn't help him catch Dom. In fact, it gets him fired. But that's okay, because in the second movie, he gets a job as with the FBI, and that's where he's recruited to catch some crooks. And of course, you know, Roman is his old friend, and so he joins the movies, and that brings us in Tej, who's the mechanic. And then finally, you know, the movies progress, and like any movie franchise in the world, at eventually some point in time, The Rock will join the franchise and make it all better. So what does this mean here? What I'm really saying is that Paul Walker was the glue that held together all of these movies, and unfortunately, Fast 8 is worse for his absence. Sadly, Paul Walker passed away in a car accident, and it's really quite disturbing. But how does this all relate to functions? Yeah, bring it back, Simon. How does this relate to functions? People here want to get some technical content as well. You won't, sorry. But when it comes to functions, we talk about composing functions. We want things to do one thing and do it really well. So we have this method here that allows us to fetch some data from a legacy XML interface, and that's great. It does one thing, it does it really well. We have another function here that is going to format that response, but it's not used to taking XML. It's used to taking JSON and converting it to HTML. So what should we do in order to solve this problem of converting from XML to HTML? We could write a new function that takes XML and outputs HTML, but we already have this really well-tested function for outputting HTML. Well, we could modify the format response function to take in XML data, but that kind of violates the do one thing really well rule. And we don't really want to change existing functions because, as we said, we've already been using them for a while. They're well-tested. We don't want to mess anything up. So instead, we'll create this glue function, which I'm calling Paul Walker, which will transform the data from the XML from the legacy side to JSON so that we can pass it to our initial function. So that's much better. And when it comes to the serverless side of things, when you're composing functions, you also do this thing where you can specify the order in which all of these functions will run. And so that way you can build much more complex interfaces out of just small discrete functions. Now, this is basic pseudocode. It has nothing to do with any of the function as a service providers at all, but pretty much everybody provides some sort of capability in order to compose larger functions out of smaller functions. So that's great. Now, this is also important because you can see that as a team, all of these disparate characters can accomplish way more than they could when they're alone. And that's kind of the same thing when you're creating applications. You're composing them by writing many small functions and getting into these bigger systems. So just in case you haven't watched the movies, some of the accomplishments that they have is they've brought down drug lords and multiple times. They went to that well more than once. They apprehended rogue secret agents again twice. And there's that one time they prevented nuclear war. I mean, sure. I mean, that's I remember Fast and the Furious started out with car thieves and eventually gets to the point where we're preventing nuclear war. Again, amazing movies. So bad they're good. And then we get into these things, and all movies need plot points, and those are the catalysts for all of the action. So without kind of these catalysts, the movie would be pretty boring. So some things that happen, and car thefts, of course, that's how everything gets started. There's numerous times where people are blackmailed. Again, that makes sense. There's an epic jailbreak in there. That's wonderful. There's kidnappings, there's murders, there's all sorts of fun stuff that happen. So these catalysts for action, how does this relate to function as a service? Again, we have events. These are catalysts for actions on IT side of things as well. So you may have a Git could be some sort of CRUD on a database. We could have a cron job that wakes up every so often and runs an action for us. We can notice that if there's a new something stored in our CDN that we need to take advantage on that, or perhaps there's an analytic trigger come up for your website, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these functions can be triggered by these various events. So these are the plot points that get our applications up and running. So that's talking mostly about function as a service, but what about serverless? So let's talk about that a little bit. Okay. So someone in the audience is thinking this right now, okay? Just don't be that person. I think we can all agree that no one should ever use that joke again. It's very much done. So please don't even start. Now I'm going to force another analogy on you. So if you're old like me, you remember going to a movie theater, and that's the way that we had to watch all of our movies. There was no other option unless you had to wait like a year or 2 years before it eventually made its way onto TV, and it was all cut up and it was just a garbage experience. So we went to movies a lot as kids. But then this wonderful thing came out. It was called the VCR, and that shifted all of your movie watching from going to a theater to your home theater. But we still had to schlep our way to Blockbuster in order to rent these VHS tapes. And that's when Netflix came along. And it's like, oh, this is a genius idea to start sending DVDs through the mail. And that was kind of the beginning of the end for VHS rental places. In fact, I can't think of the last time I saw one. So it's pretty interesting. And then, of course, Netflix, then started bringing in streaming services, directly to our TVs, and we never have to leave home ever again. And I'm in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. So if you're noticing that I'm pronouncing words very weird, it's because I'm Canadian. I'm sorry about that. But right now it is minus 20 degrees Celsius, and we had a foot of snow a couple of days ago. So I am taking well advantage of Netflix right now. But now the problem is deciding what show are we going to watch. So how does this evolution of how we consume media mirror the way that we write code? So folks may remember this. When you had all of your servers and you had them on premises and you had to do everything by yourself. So when people talk about a server closet, they actually mean we used to keep all of our servers in a closet. And occasionally, the ventilation wouldn't be that great and your servers would actually overheat and then your website would go down. And that wasn't really great. So things evolved over time. And then we got into things like infrastructure as a service. And we can take advantage of that to provide things like servers, storage, and networking. And then we don't have to worry about that kind of overheating of stuff in our closet anymore. So that's wonderful. And then moving up the chain from there, we have platform as a service. And that includes things like the operating system, some middleware, and maybe a runtime for you. So these are, you don't even have to worry about the computers in that server room. We're already taking care of installing all the operating system, making sure it's patched for you. That's wonderful. Things are getting so much easier. And then we have software as a service, which provides an entire backend for you to be able to run your application on. So that's things like Heroku, the various things from Salesforce, all sorts of fancy things. And then finally, we get to the level that we've been talking about, and that's function as a service. Now, these are the four main players in the function as a service space. You just have to pick one. They're all pretty equivalent right now. Amazon is kind of dominating things when it comes to the total amount of users. Microsoft is in second place. And amazingly enough, if you're in China, you're probably going to use something called Alibaba, which amazingly has a large number of users as well. And most people haven't heard about it at all. So how does this kind of all get back into Fast and the Furious again? So you got to think about it. It's the cars, and these are the containers that our functions are running in. And then of course we have the roads, which is the infrastructure that all of the action takes place on. So the nice thing about Fast and the Furious movies is that since it's so central to cars and roads pretty much cover the entire world, the action can take place anywhere. And the action literally does take place anywhere. Is it the Arctic or the Antarctic? I can't remember, but it doesn't matter because it was an amazing scene. Anyway, so let's talk about the difference between Furious and serverless. Well, we have cars and characters, that's Furious. And on the serverless side of things, we have the code, which is the function as a service, and the software or platform as a service side of things. And then getting into the roads, and again, that's the other folks' infrastructure. So you can, you don't have to, build roads yourself in order to drive your car. And it's the same way that we're going to take advantage of other folks' infrastructure in order to run our code. Oops, wrong direction. And then, of course, in Furious, because there is absolutely no limitations whatsoever. They have infinite possibilities of what can happen in these movies and where the action can take place. And on serverless, that's the unbounded scaling. So serverless technology is going to take care of scaling up your application for you. You don't have to worry about a lot of the stuff. So, why? Why am I talking about this? Why am I forcing this upon you? Well, you remember back when I said this talk was originally going to be a lot different than it is right now, which is mostly Fast and the Furious jokes. So I was running this app all the time on Heroku, even though it was barely used. So it was a Node Express application. Obviously, that's what Heroku runs on. It had a bunch of static assets, our HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And there was two routes, one for doing translation and another one for querying an online database. So pretty simple application. And I decided that I would convert it over to serverless technologies just to see what it was like. And so the first step that I did was taking all of those static assets and moving them to a CDN. So you could use something like Amazon's S3, or you can just use GitHub Pages. And that's the first step. And then you can see like, oh, these static assets can live out there, but they can still talk back to the original Node Express application. So we're moving towards serverless. Then the second part I did is I rewrote both the translate and the query routes to be pure functions that could run on a function as a service provider. So you may be wondering, what FaaS did I use? And in this case, I actually used Microsoft Azure. And I'd like to say that it was because I did this very in-depth, just checking all of the different function as a service platforms and see which one would be best. But basically, I listed the four of them to my daughter, and she picked the name that she thought was the coolest. So good job, Microsoft Marketing. Azure has won the 14-year-old Canadian girl market. So once I was done converting all of these functions over to the FaaS platform, I no longer needed to worry about running an Express application or Heroku at all, because I just had these two functions that I could call directly. And so we just get rid of them. So the next version of the application is just some static assets that are calling the URLs of my functions that are running on the FaaS. So that's pretty cool. I got rid of a lot of complexity of the application. I love deleting code. I hope that you love deleting code as well, because it means there's less stuff for you to actually have to test. And of course, no more hosting fees. So I stopped having to pay Heroku, I think it was like $7 a month, and replace it with the free tier that Azure has. So that's pretty great. And if that application happens to get over 1 million hits per month, well, then I'll probably have to pay it 7 pennies. So that's still a win in my book. And it was an interesting technical thing to take on. And at this point, I would like to thank Linda Nichols. Approximately at the point of time that I was thinking about doing this presentation, she also did one called Not So FaaS, What's Under the Hood, at the Serverless conference last year. I really recommend that you check out her talk as well. It's pretty amazing. And we did talk. I got permission to kind of use the same kind of jokes as well. So we're good. Now, getting into the summary of what I've talked about here today, because like I said, it's not a super technical talk, it's mostly jokes. But basically, I wanted to whet your appetite on serverless technologies and get you thinking about them. And so in summary, functions should do one and only one thing. That's very important. And everything that a function needs should be passed in via the input. You don't want to have to rely on things outside of the function's control. And the same input should produce the same output every time. And composing multiple small functions to make more complicated actions, don't start with a very complicated action. Start with very small, easily testable functions and build up from there. And then you can use events to fire off a sequence of functions, and always take advantage of other people's infrastructure so that you can focus on the code, because that's kind of what we want to be doing.
Thanks for watching.